Space. The final frontier, an infinite expanse of cosmic beauty and sheer, undiluted existential horror. Mankind has been trying to unlock its secrets ever since we first looked up. But while it's a vast universe out there, one of the more interesting planets is actually our next door neighbour. Venus, which is the only planet named after a woman, because it is mysterious, really hard to understand, and hot. And, like with most women, when a bunch of nerds try to get to know her, they make absolute clowns of themselves. The space mission where everything went wrong. The Venera program. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, it is in fact your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid has transformed gaming on the move to provide you with the ultimate free-to-play handheld experience. You will conquer raids, dungeons, campaign battles and bosses to build up your champions along the way and take part in my personal favourite mode, the PvP arena. I like my games to keep the action going, and this game pretty much guarantees non-stop action and huge battles. You can head to the dungeons and face off against deadly bosses, conquer the awesome campaign, scale the many floors of the Doom Tower, dive into high-stakes PvP fights against other players, jump into faction wars. There is so much for you to do. And in Raid, there is always something big happening, and your next action-packed fight is always no more than a few moments away. To all new Raid players, Raid's prepared something special for you. It's time to vote on your favourite starter champion. So download Raid Shadow Legends from the links below, copy your in-game player ID, then go to championselect.plarium.com and simply enter your player ID and then vote for your chosen champion. That's all there is to it. This vote runs from January the 16th to February the 10th, with all eligible entrants being in with the opportunity to win awesome in-game and real-life prizes, including epic and legendary champions, in-game items, and even Amazon gift cards worth up to $1,000. Once the vote ends on February the 10th, one champion will be crowned the winner, and the prize winners will be selected via a draw. Don't worry if you're an existing Raid player, you can still get involved. Just head to championselect.plarium.com where you can find a special promo code that everyone can use for a small in-game gift. On top of that, Raid has got something else happening. They have released a legendary champion based off of MMA and pro wrestling legend Ronda Rousey. You can get Ronda for free right now, whether you are a new or long-time player, just by logging into Raid. All you've got to do is log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and February the 20th, and Ronda is all yours. To celebrate Ronda's arrival in Raid, if you also use the special promo code RAIDRONDA for all users, you can get a bunch of helpful stuff, so check the available promo codes in the description. So use my link in the description box down below to download Raid for free on your phone or PC. And if you want a starting boost in Raid Shadow Legends, then hit the link down below or scan the QR code on the screen to get unique bonuses worth $35. That is 100,000 silver, 50 gems and 2 epic skill tomes. And the epic champion Jotun, so you can summon a great champion as soon as you get into the game. These rewards are only available to new players and only for the next 30 days, and you can find these rewards here in your inbox. Now, I understand that when it comes to the title of The Space Mission Where Everything Went Wrong, there are some strong contenders out there, but a bunch of people being deep fried alive isn't exactly a very funny subject, hence why I'm granting this particular mission that title, because this one isn't an awful, horrific tragedy. Instead, this one's just kinda funny. In the 1950s, the Cold War was in full swing when the US and the Soviets had a bright idea. You see, launching rockets at each other was an astoundingly terrible idea for a whole litany of reasons, so instead, they decided to launch them into the sky. And because the sky is actually very interesting once you get high enough, in both senses, this kick-started the biggest dick measuring contest in human history. The space race. Right away, the Soviets got a good solid head start with Sputnik. But then they squandered all of that goodwill in the sequel by murdering a good girl named Laika, and then lying about it for nearly half a century. Seriously, don't look up what really happened to Laika. It'll ruin your day. But thanks to Sputnik, the Soviets now had working satellites. So naturally, the next step was to meet the neighbours. In 1961, the Soviets turned their attention to the planet Venus, and they launched the Venera program. Venera is Russian for Venus. You've seen Soviet architecture, they're not a creative bunch. But there is just one issue with the idea of sending probes to Venus. It's a little bit far away. Depending on the time of year, it can be anywhere between 24 to 162 million miles away. So the probes have quite a bit of travelling to do. The big explosive white-knuckle launch might look like the hardest part of any space mission, but that's actually not the case. The hard part is actually just sitting there for several months while the thing is en route, desperately hoping and praying that nothing happens to the probe as it travels through the void of space with nothing more than extremely intricately planned and calculated flight paths and a little bit of fate and a whole lot of luck guiding it to its destination. And since the journey takes many, many months, there is plenty of time for fate to just go, haha, no, and break something. Which is exactly what happened to Venera 1 when it was sent to fly past Venus in 1961. Imagine dedicating your career to years of careful planning, spending God knows how many rubles, and doing an ungodly amount of maths just for this one flyby, just for the probe to drift right past the planet without recording a single thing because it fucking broke. And then it happened again. 4 years later, Venera 2 was launched and had a communication failure, which resulted in the probe being completely useless. I mean, it was recording the data as it went past. It just wasn't sending any of it back to Earth. But the thing is, it could be worse. Sure, the probes ended up being dead on arrival, but at least they actually arrived. You see, Venera 2 isn't actually the second probe. Shit, Venera 1 isn't even the first. As those of you that are not proud children of Owley probably know, space is pretty high up. So it took a lot of effort to get the probes up there in the first place, and the upper stage launch failures were very, very common. So the probes were named like Roman babies, in the sense that they weren't named until they survived infancy, or, in the case of the probes, they managed to escape Earth's orbit. So there were several probes that just simply didn't work, some of them even blew up during launch, and the Soviets just went, nah, that doesn't count, and they just didn't designate them as planetary missions. They just kind of pretended like they never happened. So there is an entire roster of bastard children of the Venera program that were just called Cosmos and then given a number. But after those two failed flybys, the Soviets decided to take a closer look and actually send a probe into Venus's atmosphere. Therefore, the 900-kilogram Venera 3 became the first man-made object to hit another planet. And please note I said hit, not land. because the atmosphere pretty much absolutely annihilated it upon entry and the thing just crashed into the surface. But while the result of the mission was very disappointing, even if Venera 3 had actually managed to make the descent safely, the probe was in for a very bad time regardless, because the majority of its successors barely lasted an hour. And it's not even just wear and tear from the journey or the rough landings that do the probes in. Despite Mercury being closer to the Sun, Venus's temperature outside of the Sun is the highest in our solar system. So high that its surface literally melts lead. But it would be impressive if the probe actually lasted long enough to melt, because they would most likely be crushed by the massive pressure of the planet's atmosphere first. It's funny how the only planet with a woman's name is also the most hostile. In 1967, the next mission became the first one that actually gave the Soviets some data to show for their hard work. While Venera 4 never actually survived its descent, it did manage to make a number of atmospheric measurements as it was plummeting to its doom, reporting that Venus's atmosphere is 97% carbon dioxide with a little bit of nitrogen, oxygen and water vapour mixed in there. It also revealed that Venus doesn't have much of a magnetic field. While this is certainly progress, and Venera 5 and Venera 6 were similarly successful in 1969, it doesn't exactly sound like the program was keeping the Soviets from falling behind their rivals, because around this time, the Americans had not only discovered the world's funniest astronaut in Michael Collins, but they had also put the first man on the moon. So, the Yanks had won the race to the moon, and the aliens had put a ton of probes in Uranus. Ha ha ha, that joke will never not be funny. But the Soviets were going to bring in the 1970s with an improvement in their fortunes, because the Venera program was finally about to pay some real dividends. On the 15th of December 1970, Venera 7 actually landed on Venus, and it became the first to transmit data from the actual planet's surface, thanks to the fact that it was designed specifically to land this time. It was much bulkier than its predecessors, and it was essentially armoured, which allowed it to land mostly intact and survive for a bit longer on the surface. The Soviets had also given the probe less to do, because fewer experiments meant fewer potential points of failure. However, despite being better equipped to survive the landing, safely touching down with nothing going wrong seemed to be too much of an ask, because the parachute actually ripped during Venera 7's descent, and the thing fell out of the sky for almost half an hour. That's how long the descent was, before finally crashing. But thankfully, despite the signal being severely weakened and the pressure sensor breaking because the thing rattled into the planet at 100 miles an hour, the probe still managed to transmit some data. The most notable information that Venera 7 sent back was the fact that the planet's temperature is 475 degrees Celsius, which was further proved 23 minutes later when the thing fucking melted, and it was then completely crushed by the atmosphere, which the probe did actually manage to help us quantify. Your probe literally being crushed by the atmosphere, of course, isn't a good thing, but it does help you calculate and get an idea of how much atmospheric pressure there actually is. So, in scientific terms, the Russians were able to calculate that the atmospheric pressure of Venus was enough to crush a probe. Data is still data. A year and a half later, Venera 8 sent back even more temperature data, which confirmed that Venus is in fact very hot. You know how the Mars rovers are programmed to do a bunch of cute anthropomorphic stuff like singing happy birthday to themselves? I think the Venus probes would just be screaming.
No! Stop! No! 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 No!
Nevertheless, progress was being made, and despite all of the scorching temperatures and hostile atmosphere, not all of the probes crumbled under the pressure of unlocking Venus's secrets. Venera 13 and 14 were only expected to last for about 32 minutes, but despite the odds, the former survived for over 2 hours, and the latter managed to last for 57 minutes. But these probes weren't just notable for their relative longevity. Venera 9 had been a major upgrade on the previous probes, and the 5-ton unit was able to capture the first black and white pictures of the surface of Venus in 1975. But, as impressive as this is, it was Venera 13 that succeeded first in colour photography, though the pictures are shown here in black and white because they were initially processed in the past. While the first colour pictures were taken on the 1st of March 1982, this was actually the third attempt because, surprise, surprise, the colour cameras on Venera 11 and 12 had both failed. But colour pictures are absolutely nothing compared to the other thing that Venera 13 had to show us. There is life on Venus. That's right, according to Leonid Ksanfomality, I don't know, some rushky-bushky stupid name, who worked at the Russian Academy of Sciences, who worked on the programme itself, a certain something appeared to emerge, fluctuate and disappear in the different pictures that were sent back, which led him to believe that this unidentified scurrying object was moving around. Now, I know that this alleged scorpion-like organism that was also described as a crab sounds very unlikely because the place is such a fucking death trap, but Ksanfomality was prepared for such a close-minded rebuttal from the unfaithful, and he said, "What if we forget about the current theories about the non-existence of life on Venus? Let us boldly suggest that the object's morphological features would allow us to say that they are living." This essentially is a very fancy scientific equivalent of "trust me, bro." Now, I'm not going to say that aliens aren't real just because we haven't seen any. I also thought the hobbits weren't real until I fucking married one. For all we know, aliens just took one look at us and decided that our stupid monkey brains are just too dumb to be worth their time. However, that doesn't mean that Ksanfomality was right, because his evidence actually shows something much, much more mundane than Jupiter having given Venus crabs. His aliens were lens caps. What Ksanfomality thought were alien crabs or scorpions were actually just the lens caps from the cameras. But wait, he said they were moving, I hear you cry, and there's a simple explanation for that as well. The reason why they show up in different places on the photos is just the fact that these were panoramas taken by multiple cameras. The probe had a camera on the front and another on the back. So it was just two lens caps. It wasn't the same alien moving from one camera to the other. It was just each camera taking a picture of its own lens cap. And all of the blurs that looked like moving aliens were actually just down to very bad image processing, because this was the 80s. These anomalies were basically just visual white noise. Further debunking the alien theory was the arrival of Venera 14, 4 days after its predecessor, where the same organisms were seen in pretty much the exact same locations in the shots, making it clear that the lens caps just popped off like that. After all, I can't imagine the aliens going out of their way to pose in the exact same way in front of each and every camera they find, like Instagram thoughts on holiday. But if you nerds wanted that phrased in a much more sciencey way, a research technician at Arizona State University named Jonathan Hill said himself, and I quote, "If those objects were already on the surface of Venus, what are the chances that Venera 13 and 14, which landed nearly 1,000 kilometres apart, would both land inches away from the only ones in sight, and they would be in the exact same positions relative to the spacecraft?" And, as if that wasn't enough to thoroughly debunk the alien theory, the full colour picture put the theory to bed once and for all. For his mistake, Ksanfomality shared the fate of pretty much every smart kid in class that got a simple question so hilariously wrong. He got absolutely dragged by the scientific community. For example, Hill also said that the situation was an example of, and I quote, "letting your mind see patterns in low-resolution data that simply aren't real." Carl Sagan's Planetary Society also described it as much less convincing than the Mars Sasquatch. Yes, people actually thought that Bigfoot was a Martian because the Mars rover took a picture of a funny rock. However, it also turned out that Venera 14's lens caps were going to cause a lot more problems, because part of that mission was to measure the compressibility of the planet's soil. But when the instrument pressed down into the soil, it was delivering absolutely insane readings. Holy shit, this planet is rock hard. We cannot breach the soil. The soil isn't breachable in any way. This doesn't make any sense. This absolutely defies scientific explanation. Yeah, the instrument was pressing on the lens cap. Out of all the places that the lens cap could have fucking landed, it landed right under the instrument that was to check the soil. And because this is a probe, not a rover, they couldn't just move it to another location where it could reach the soil. So there was absolutely nothing they could do. They were completely fucked. Overall, despite the weird and wonderful ways that the missions managed to go completely wrong, there was still a veneer of success to the program, and we did manage to learn a lot about Venus thanks to the probes. For example, we learned that part of the reason why Venus is so hot is the fact that the CO2 atmosphere created a greenhouse effect that essentially runs on a feedback loop, cooking the absolute fuck out of the planet. As we went into earlier as well, the probes and landers also sent back a lot of really valuable pictures. And we didn't just have to rely on pictures to learn about the planet's geography, because the probes were able to actually collect soil samples. In addition to pictures, Venera 13 also gave us the first sound ever heard on another planet by recording Venus's wind. But the Soviets managed to do one better than just taking pictures and recordings of the surface. They finished off the program in June of 1983 by sending Venera 15 and 16 to orbit and map the planet. Because, of course, Venus would have orbiters. Everyone gets so caught up in the successes and discoveries of science that it's very easy to forget about all of the failures, especially after recent events. But there is actually a real problem in the scientific community where studies that didn't prove their hypothesis often don't get published, because the journals would rather take the ones with positive results because they are seen as a bit more exciting. But it's really important to highlight both, because knowing that something doesn't work is just as valuable as discovering something new, since the scientific method is essentially just trial and error. So, even a failed experiment can teach us something useful. Or, like in this case, can also just be really funny. Besides, to err is human and shit happens. There is nothing wrong with accepting that we're not infallible, especially when the string of failures leading up to a success only highlights just how difficult the task is and how impressive these breakthroughs are. After all, while great progress is made by standing on the shoulders of giants, even giants need some time to grow. So, no matter how bad you may feel you are at your job, just remember that we tend to hold scientists up on a pedestal as the wisest, smartest, and most brilliant minds that humanity has to offer. And yet, some of them thought a lens cap was an alien.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody just subscribe!